My name is John Antos, and I would like to welcome you back to our series on business process management. This is my good friend Jim Brimson. In one of our previous videos, we talked about the importance of business process management as a way to manage in the future. And Jim, do you want to summarize just a couple of points we made in that last video?
Yes, processes are the new management systems of the future. They enable an organization to become much more forward-looking in their information and also adaptive to changes in the environment. Those are going to be two requisites of organizational management from here as far as we can see.
Now, Jim, when you read about processes, people have many different definitions of what a process is. Can you tell our viewers here what you think a process is?
Absolutely. A process is, first of all, we have to understand, as John pointed out, that every discipline has its own definition of what a process is. And as a consequence of that, we haven't really been able to get a synergy between different disciplines and the way they look and approach processes, and interdisciplinary knowledge. So the goal of process management is to be able to understand the commonality at the most basic level, how the world behaves. And processes provide a foundation for understanding that. Now, let us begin by looking at what you typically find in most business, quality, and other engineering type of books as the way they define processes. The typical definition is that there's an input. It then triggers the process, and there's an output. In addition, there are controls that control whether or not the process achieves the output that was desired. And there are typically targets of what that output should look like. So people organize a process. Let's say we're milling a part. Then you bring the raw material in, the metal to be milled. There then is the milling machine, the people, the facilities, all are brought together that actually perform the milling. And then the output is the milled product. There may be actual controls on the mill itself, but also there are financial controls of what that part should cost, and there are quality controls of what it should look like when it's finally done. And finally, the targets they define what that milled part would look like on the outside. So if you look at this from a industrial engineering, a quality, or a business perspective, this definition of a process seems very adequate for fulfilling what we do. The problem becomes that when we look at things this way, rarely do the accountants look at what the cost is in the same way that the quality people do, that the engineers do. So we have all these various disciplines using a similar model, but each looking at it from their own perspective, and as a consequence, there's not a universal management framework that really ties this together.
So Jim, since some of our viewers are from government agencies and some of our viewers are from service, can we say, based on this model, that if I'm a government agency and I'm issuing driver's license, I still have an input, which is an application. I still have to process and issue that driver's license, and I still have an output, which is the driver's license. And if I'm a service company and I'm processing loans, I still have an input, which is to take and fill out that application and review that application, so that's my process. And then the output is either accepting or rejecting that particular loan application.
Yes, this model has been used in almost every industry and is seen in the vast majority of textbooks that discuss processes.
Okay? And then do you want to talk about the next slide that you have for us, or?
Yes, I'd like to talk about the next slide. Now, when you begin to look beyond just the business needs for processes, if we look into the sciences and other areas, we find that they have also looked at processes, although very few of them have articulated they're looking at processes. But when you look behind it, they are really looking at processes. But they often approach it from an extremely different perspective. Let's take a broader definition of processes that have been brought in, again, from many disciplines. To begin with, before a process begins to be executed, there exists an initial set of conditions that represents this box here. The initial set of conditions you didn't really focus on in the previous slide, although, again, controls, you could argue, might take some of this into consideration. But basically, it's not widely discussed in the process literature. But initial conditions are critical. Take chaos theory. Chaos theory, which is more of one from physics and other natural sciences, basically says that the initial conditions are critical to the performance of a process. So if we start at a certain point and begin the process, then every point that we start at can be very different and practically is different every time we execute a process, even though it might be very small. But every starting point will impact the actual transformation process. So initial conditions are critical and ever-changing. So to look at processes without considering the initial conditions will never allow the type of flexibility needed to make the process work effectively.
So for example, Jim, if we're cleaning the beach and we have this major oil spill in the Gulf, then obviously cleaning the beach under those environmental conditions is a lot different than if it's just a normal Sunday afternoon or Monday morning and the county authorities are going through to pick up the garbage on the beach. Those are different starting conditions, and we need to understand that when we look at our process.
Absolutely. And not only that, but every beach will have its own unique characteristics that is polluted. So not only will the fact that it's a polluted beach impact the cleanup, but the characteristics of the beach itself will impact the process performance itself.
Okay. Then what's the next part of this slide?
The next part of this is the actual process transformation. But before we get to that, let's talk about the process environmental factors. They are equally important to the initial set of conditions. The environmental factors are things that are beyond the control of the actual process, but impact the process. So if we look at the example of the beach cleanup, oil on the beach that John just alluded to, then the environmental factors are: what is the state of technology? Where are the ships or other cleanup technologies? Are they available at the point you need them? So there's many environmental factors that are as equal or more important to the actual process itself that impact its performance.
So for example, Jim, if sugar is going from 15 cents a pound to 30 cents a pound and then back to 15 cents a pound, obviously the cost of the raw material has changed dramatically. Or in this environment where we've had mortgages and people, the government is helping owners of homes to refinance their mortgages, but people are losing jobs, there's high unemployment, we're unsure about the price of houses. That's a lot different to look at a loan application in that environment versus a more traditional environment where unemployment may be only 3%, housing prices are stable or going up, and we need to understand that when we look at our process, because those processes will be different in different environments.